So we're going to continue talking about translation. We're going to open up with prayer, and then we'll get started. So, God, we just thank you for another opportunity just to meet and gather and just discuss your word, Lord, and thank you for those that have came out, God. And we ask that you just be with us, Lord, as we after the class depart our ways. That you just keep us safe, Lord, and help us to learn from you, God. And we thank you for all that you do for us. In Jesus' name, Amen. All right, so. Last time you can pick a seat anywhere. You might need to get another handout from John. I think we had only 8, but we can get you one after class, or you can share with somebody. But okay. So last time we started off where we were talking about medieval translations. So we talked about things like Tyndale's Bible, Wycliffe's Bible, the Coverdale, the Great Bible. We had some other ones up here. And so part of what we were getting to, because we were talking about medieval translations, is that, and we kind of wrapped up with Bruce Metzger's comment here about, he says, for idiom and vocabulary, Tyndale deserves the greatest credit, for melody and harmony, Coverdale, and for scholarship and accuracy, the Geneva version, and what he was talking about, the King James Bible. And so we were talking about the King James and even the translators themselves as we looked at some of their preface and some of the things they said. What they were doing, they were building upon their predecessors. And by just that alone, we know that, well, they would expect other people to do the same, that other Bibles would come along, that they would be building upon what they had done. And that's just kind of where we left off. So, when we talk about using, the problem with using a 400-year-old translation is, even though most people would say it's a translation that never changes, it's actually the opposite that's true. A translation that never updates its language is constantly shifting because words come in and out of culture and constantly alter meaning over time. I never even thought about this until it was a video of Daniel Wallace, and it's pretty old, but that's so true though, because it's like, okay, we want a translation that never changes, but over time people use different words, the culture changes, and so translation updates and things like that, they're just necessary. They're just a necessary part of the Bible, and we even talked about how even the King James translators recognize that with the Septuagint for the Jewish people. And so here's just a list of some of the words that from the King James that most of us would have no idea what they mean. You have almung, chode, habergeon, hosen, ouches, ring-streaked, ligure, sycamine, leasing, and sod pottage. And there's a much bigger list that could be made, but just kind of get the idea across. And the whole premise is this, that over time, this list, 100 years from now, it will be bigger. And that would be true of any translation. In fact, if you really wanted a good idea, if you went back to a 1382 Wycliffite Bible, it would be unreadable. I mean, just because it's so far back. And so, just like Bob Gibson was bringing up, there's a 2020 NASB now. And so, if someone now took the NASB 2020 and said, you know what, I think this is the one. This is the perfect Bible. Guess what? 200 years from now, that Bible would be irrelevant. It would be irrelevant just because that's the nature of language and culture and how those things work together. And so updates and revisions, they are needed. But you even have what are called false friends within words. So there might be words that you say, okay, I don't recognize that word at all. But here is just an example of, so it's 1 Kings 18:21. It says, and Elijah came unto all the people and said, how long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him. And the people answered him, not a word. So normally, if I just asked you, what does the word halt mean? You'd say what? Stop. Yeah.
But not there.
But not there. You're absolutely right. And so you actually see this in the New Testament as well, that so the servant came and showed his Lord these things. Then the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, go out quickly to the streets and lanes of the city and bring in hither the poor and the maimed and the halt and the blind. Well, halt here, it means limping, right? That's what Rosalind was saying. So when Elijah was saying, how long halt ye between two opinions, how long are you going to be limping between this way and that way? And you go, oh, I didn't realize it meant that. And so there's words that you don't know that you don't know. And so they're false friends. They're words you think you know the meaning of, but you don't. And another one is coasts. is, so in Exodus chapter 10, and the locusts went up all over the land of Egypt and rested in all the coasts of Egypt. Very grievous were they. Before them there was no such locust as they, neither after them shall such be, or shall be such. And it's the same, Joshua uses this word a lot. And they shall divide it into 7 parts. Judah shall abide in their coast on the south, and the house of Joseph shall abide in their coast on the north. Now normally when you think of coast, you think of what? Water. Yeah. They have nothing in mind. So the coasts here means borders. And so, again, you picture the sea or something like that, but that's not at all the way this word is being used. And so those are just a couple examples of, you're reading it and you go, well, I think I know that word, but it doesn't seem to, so, anyways. Now don't be offended by this. So this is going to really examine, give a good example. So consider how the following misprint in an early edition of the King James Version sounds very different now than it did back then in Deuteronomy 5:24. Behold, the Lord of our God hath showed us his glory in his ass. Where the last word was intended to be greatness, the word in question at the time was not considered to be an obscenity, but still calling God a donkey wasn't acceptable either. So the printer, Robert Barker, he was taken to court and fined 300 euros, the equivalent around $90,000 today, and he died in debtor's prison. So we instantly read that and go, oh, you kind of cringe at it and go, oh, that's not good. But it did mean something different back then, how they might have read it. But this printed edition, it's a misprint, but it's not known so much for the misprint in Deuteronomy 5:24. It's better known for a different error, and which got it named the Wicked Bible. So in Exodus chapter 20, where they are given the 10 Commandments, in the part where they're given the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. In the 7th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, they accidentally left the word not out. And so that's part of what got this guy in trouble, and that's what got the nickname the Wicked Bible. And so this is actually a lesser known textual issue, but you look at that and you go, so look at how the Revised Version, Revised Standard Version, and New Revised Standard Version, how they differ and why there's these updates. So it says, I will take no bullock out of thy house. What's a bullock? What is that? I will accept no bull from your house. Well, that means something different today if you accept no bull from somebody. And so the NRSV 1990 says, I will not accept a bull from your house. And you go, okay, they're talking about an actual animal. Okay. 2 Corinthians 11:25, thrice I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned. 3 times I've been beaten with rods, once I was stoned. 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I received a stoning. And so we all would see how that could be misunderstood. You only got stoned once? In today's culture, that would mean something very different to a lot of people. Once I was stoned. James 2:3, and ye have respect to him that weareth the gay clothing, and you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing. And if you take notice of the one wearing the fine clothes. And so again, if we hear gay clothing, we think of something a little different, right? All right. So we've mentioned how the King James New Testament was based on a handful of manuscripts. So when much earlier manuscripts were discovered, in 1870, the Church of England wanted to update both the language and the text upon which the translators built on. The committee was given various principles to guide them and were to introduce as few alterations as possible while providing footnotes to indicate where the changes were made. And so in 1881, the Revised Version New Testament was published, and with the Old Testament coming out just a few years later in 1885. The new translation was not only released in England, but it was also released in the United States in New York City, where booksellers started working at 4 a.m. and within 11 hours sold 250,000 copies, about 3 million in its first year. So controversy was great due to such dramatic changes in the text from its predecessor. These include the textual changes we've already talked about, things like the Comma Johanneum, that's 1 John 5, 7, and 8. They talked about, so that was taken out of the text completely. The Long Reigning of Mark and the Pericope Adulterae, being the woman caught in adultery story from the Gospel of John, they were marked for the first time with brackets and given textual, these footnotes for it. And this was the first time that, Tyndale's Plowboy was seeing these things. And so people just, of course, were just, going crazy over it. So here's actually a picture of the Chicago Tribune where they published the Revised Version New Testament. It takes up 16 pages. And I don't know if that, I mean, it doesn't seem like enough, but I don't know if they got the whole thing in there or whatever. But in May 22nd of 1881, here in the Chicago Tribune, they published the Revised Version New Testament. So the Revised Version was not using the Textus Receptus as its base text for the New Testament, but instead heavily relied upon three great unsealed manuscripts that were not available to the King James translators. So you have Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, and Codex Alexandrinus. And you can see a letter that's often correlated to them. So Vaticanus is B, Sinaiticus is Aleph, and Codex Alexandrinus is A. And it's because of these immense changes that the Revised Version, and particularly the manuscripts that support it, would be criticized. In fact, you will often hear strong language aimed at these three manuscripts to the extent of saying that people worship them. And I have heard there was a debate that James White had with a guy named D.A. Waite, and D.A. Waite is King James only. And he actually said that in the debate. He says, people practically worship these manuscripts. I mean, I don't know anybody that worships them. But there was a later interview that D.A. Waite had where he completely removed the word practically, and he said that people, so that's the view of a lot of people, is that these early manuscripts come along and people they worship them, and all this stuff. So so though these manuscripts aren't worshipped, they do represent great treasures to the world of textual criticism, and the discovery of a much more primitive text. So Sinaiticus is probably the most notable of the three. It's probably got the most history behind it and probably the most interesting story about it. So this colossal manuscript is dated between 325 and 350 AD, and it contains the entirety of the Old and New Testament in Greek. So the Old Testament, it's a Septuagint, so it's not got Hebrew in it. So it was discovered by Labigot Friedrich Constantine von Tischendorf, and he happened upon this masterpiece while visiting St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai in the mid-1800s. And the story cannot be captured any better than Tischendorf's own words. So I'm going to read you a little portion of what he wrote here. He says, "It was at the foot of Mount Sinai in the convent of St. Catherine that I discovered the pearl of all my researches. In visiting the monastery in the month of May 1844, I perceived in the middle of the great hall a large and wide basket full of old parchments, and a librarian who was a man of information told me that 2 heaps of papers like these, they moldered by time, that is, they molded, had already been committed to the flames. What was my surprise to find amid this heap of papers a considerable number of sheets of a copy of the Old Testament in Greek, which seemed to me to be one of the most ancient I had ever seen." So basically he goes to this monastery, he sees these parchments in this little basket, and he notices they're molded up, but they're copies of the Septuagint. And he goes, "Hey, what's going on with these?" And they're like, "Oh, we're going to just throw those in the fire." And he's like, he's going crazy over this thing. And so he says, "The authorities of the monastery allowed me to possess myself of a third of these parchments, or about 43 sheets, all the more readily as they were designated for the fire. But I could not get them to yield up the possession of the remainder. The too lively satisfaction which I had displayed had aroused their suspicions as to the value of the manuscript. I transcribed a page of the text of Isaiah and Jeremiah, and enjoined on the monks to take religious care of all such remains which might fall their way." So he was looking a little kooky over this stuff, and they were not so sure about him, and they kind of said, "Oh, we don't want you to So, anyways, so Tischendorf, he wanted to study the rest of the manuscript, but the monks would not part with it. So he returned 9 years later, and the manuscript was nowhere to be found. So he gained the authority of Caesar Alexander II of Russia upon his third attempt in 1859. This is 15 years later. And the last day of his visit, one of the stewards invited Tischendorf to look at a Septuagint that the steward had boasted that he also had read a copy of. And he retrieved the tome wrapped in a red cloth. Basically, he pulls it from the corner, because Tischendorf says, "I've read a copy of the Septuagint," and the monk goes, "Oh yeah, I've got one of those too, let me go get it." And so he goes and it's in this red cloth, and he's looking at it, and he says, "I unrolled the cover and discovered to my great surprise, not only those very fragments which 15 years before I had taken out of the basket, but also other parts of the Old Testament, the New Testament complete, and in addition the Epistle of Barnabas and a part of the Pastor of Hermas. full of joy, which this time I had the self-command to conceal from the steward and the rest of the community, I asked, if in a careless way, for permission to take the manuscript in my sleeping chamber and look over it at more leisure. And so, I can imagine him this time, he's kind of learned his lesson from, because he was looking probably a little nutty, and so he takes it back and probably gets in his room and just drools all over this thing. And so, Tischendorf realized the amazing manuscript for what it was, the earliest surviving New Testament. He remarked, the most precious biblical treasure in existence, a document whose age and importance exceeded that of all the manuscripts which I had ever examined. And so, again, this is the oldest Bible that we have. I mean, this is about 350, 325 AD, Old and New Testament. I mean, it's just amazing. Tischendorf, by the way, there's a character that most everybody in here would be familiar with, of which there's a character that he's kind of based on, and that is Indiana Jones. And so the character Indiana Jones, he's this archaeologist that runs around. That most people believe that he's based on Tischendorf. And Tischendorf, he died at the age of 59 because he burned himself out. I mean, he really was just all over the place, and that was kind of the life that he lived. So although Sinaiticus, as well as Vaticanus and Alexandrinus, there were huge findings to which the likes of Tischendorf and Brooke Foss Westcott and John Anthony Hort, they were deeply impressed with. Their views of this manuscript, it lacked proper balance. So these were awesome manuscripts, but they were not nearly as bad as people that are TR advocates, Textus Receptus, alleged them to be, nor as good as these three men had hoped for. But it is these three unsealed manuscripts that constitute what's called the Westcott and Hort text that began to be used by later translation committees. So if you ever hear about the Westcott and Hort text, a lot of times it's talked about in a very negative connotation. That's the text that Brooke Foss Westcott and John Anthony Hort came up with, based on these three early manuscripts. And they really didn't have a proper balance of them, because they did just give them a lot more credibility than they probably needed, as far as asking the question, what did the Bible originally say, and things like that. Newer Bibles are obviously, they consider these three manuscripts because they are good, but they're not the end-all be-all. But Westcott and Hort, you'll hear about their text from time to time, and these two men kind of innovated the realm of textual criticism as we kind of know it today. And so, even though there was technically it's happened, do you have a question? I didn't. Yes.
I was going to wait for you to start.
Oh, you're good. You're good.
I'm sorry, I don't know what UNCIAL unsealed.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
What that means.
So an unsealed manuscript, and I had this in some notes, and I've talked about a million things, so it's okay. But so unseals mean they are the type of manuscript. They're written in all capital letters. There's no spaces between the words, and there's no punctuation in the sentence. And so an unsealed manuscript is just a different name of what's called a majuscule. So when you think majuscule, think capital letters. So most of the manuscripts we have from much later, so about the 9th century, we have what are called minuscule manuscripts. So that's like if you were seeing something in Greek today, you would see it in, you'd have capital and lowercase letters with spaces between the words and punctuation, just like, but for the first 800 or 900 years, most manuscripts didn't do that. It was just like this big block of letters, with no stopping in it. And so unseals, they kind of constitute the earliest stage of the manuscript tradition. So does that make?
So in other words, it's a manuscript that doesn't have any spaces. It's all capital letters. There's no punctuation, and good luck reading it. Yeah,
right. Yeah. So people that even go ahead.
Are there capital letters in? I don't know Greek. Are there capital letters in?
Yeah. So like if I got like my Nession 28 out that's in my Kindle or whatever, it would have capital letters for so it would have a capital P for Peter, and then the rest of the word would be lowercase. It does make it easier to read. I mean, it's but what I was going to say is, most people that go to seminary and learn Greek and stuff like that, good luck reading the unsealed text, because it is completely different. I mean, you'd have to almost sit there and decipher it, and they don't do you any favors by, just like in English, when we get to we start writing a word and it needs to go to the next line, how we'll put a hyphen. They did that without the hyphen, and so that just makes it all the worse,
Yes.
So it's very difficult.
At least they went left to right.
Do it now?
At least they went left to right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And those three manuscripts, by the way, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus, they're very good-looking, clean manuscripts where they did make things easier to read to an extent. So they would kind of like do certain things to let you know this starts a new paragraph. I mean, even if it's not a new sentence, you know. So they did start to innovate some things. But so there's often this rumor you'll hear that it's like, okay, you know, whenever you hear like Vaticanus, the Westcott Court text, it's like, oh, they just go with the earliest reading possible. That's all they look at. And listen, early attestation is really good for like readings in a text and things like that. How early a certain reading comes along is certainly, it's a big deal, but it's not everything. In fact, this is a great example of showing you that. So just before the first time that Tischendorf went to Mount Sinai when he found Sinaiticus, the year before that, in 1843, there was a manuscript that was deciphered that was previously unreadable from the 5th century, and it was unreadable because it's what is called a palimpsest, meaning the text had been scraped clean by another scribe and reused the material for writing. Tischendorf spent 2 years researching these 150 papyri leaves, retracing the letters of the undertext. Palimpsest, that's what it means, by the way. It means to be scraped clean, and they had methods that they would do this, and they would do it primarily with like the animal skins, so vellum and parchment. You could do it with papyri, which these were.
So it's like erasing it?
Yeah.
Scraping it clean, erasing it.
So this isn't of the text we're talking about, but I wanted to find a picture that you could actually kind of see what I was talking about. So you see the arrow on the right is actually pointing to the text, and if you just glanced at this, you go, oh yeah, there's writing on there. Well, the arrow right here, you can see that's pointing to kind of where the binding is, and you can see there was something written before that. And so that's what Tischendorf was doing, was retracing what was written underneath. And he spent 2 years doing this with these 150 papyri leaves of Revelation. And so part of why I bring this up is just to explain how much work people put into this type of research. I mean, it's so tedious. I mean, who wants to sit there and do this? There's people that kind of have this anti-intellectualism, and if they're a scholar, they're automatically evil and bad and stuff. And listen, there's some scholars out there, I'll just tell you, that are really stupid. That have no spirituality about them at all, and I completely understand. However, we would not have the Bible we have today without scholars, without people that are in the field, that are doing the work, that are putting in this time, that are making these discoveries for us, doing stuff that no one else wants to do. And Tischendorf is one of those people. And so, the manuscript did you have a question? Okay. The manuscript is known as Ephraemi Rescriptus, and it's become the second most important manuscript for the book of Revelation. But this manuscript has been a huge insight for the original wording for Revelation in general. However, the reading at Revelation 13:18 does not read 666, but it reads 616. So, Ephraemi Rescriptus was the only manuscript to read this way until 1998, until at the Ashmolean Museum of Oxford University, there were several papyri published, one of which was a manuscript consisting of 26 fragments and represented 9 chapters of Revelation. P115 is the oldest manuscript we possess of this passage of Revelation 13:18, which also reads the number as 616. So the 2 earliest manuscripts we have for Revelation 13:18, the number actually is 616 in our earliest manuscripts. Now, if you're wondering, well, why haven't they changed it in our text? Because there's good reasons. For instance, we have an early church father named Irenaeus. He mentioned this. He realized there was a floating around at 616, but he says most manuscripts of his day were 666. And so there's other reasons that go into this thing, but just to point out, just because there's an earlier reading doesn't necessarily mean that everyone would agree, hey, that's probably original or not. And so it's kind of a little bit of a myth about the world of textual criticism and stuff like that, they just go with the earliest thing. Whatever the earliest thing they have is, well, no, that's not true. I do think it's funny, though, I grew up listening to like heavy metal and rock, and there's a album by Iron Maiden called The Number of the Beast, and they have a song called The Number of the Beast, and if they ever found out it was 616, they'd have to change it. I don't know how it worked with half those guys probably not being around anymore, and of course all the literature that has been made on 666 would just be tossed into the garbage, and that would be kind of interesting. But anyways.
So textual criticism has worked to say there's these 2 that say this, but all the other ones have 666.
So it's not, so all the other manuscripts do have 666, but there's more that goes into it. So 616 is the 2 earliest that we have, but there will be other reasons why they think that 666 is still original. So they would look at things like early church fathers that I just mentioned, like Irenaeus. I think there's other church fathers that might mention it also. But we also look at, there's just internal evidence. Some of it gets kind of beyond what I'm capable of. But no one has jumped to the conclusion that just because it's the earliest, that means, well, this must be the reading. So again, I was just pointing it out to kind of demolish this myth that, well, we found an earlier reading, let's just put it into the text. That's not how they do it. So while the Revised Version ever became more popular than the King James, it opened up the door for a whole new age of Bible translations. So the latter half of the 20th century was riddled with new Bible translations due to the influence of the Revised Version. After it had reached the States with such surprising sales, people began to bootleg copies, and a team was put in place to produce the American edition of the Revised Version and responded to the counterfeits by naming the edition the American Standard Version. And so you had the Revised Version that was released in England, and it was released in the States that we just talked about, with the Chicago Tribune and all that stuff. But you begin to have them sort of split off. So you have the American version of it, and you have the English version of it. And so you have the Revised Version, which is again in England, and then you have the American Standard Version. So you start to see that there's two different lines, and so I kind of wanted to lay that out as we go forward, so that they're kind of based on the same thing. They came from the same thing, but now there's two different lines of versions out there. So go ahead.
Is that because English and British English and American English are different?
I guess, I don't know. I suppose since there was a team put together in America to, I guess, make it more comparable to the States. I would guess that's the reason. That seems logical to me, but I don't know off the top of my head. But the Revised Version underwent a revision of its own to produce the Revised Standard Version. Perhaps what the Revised Standard Version is best known for is the first translation to shift Isaiah 7:14 from telling us that a virgin would conceive to a young woman. And so a lot of people, you've probably heard of this whole controversy before. If you haven't, we're going to get into it. So truth be told, it's a tricky issue. So the conflict is concerning the Hebrew word Alma, and then you have, so Alma does mean young maiden or young woman, but it can certainly entail a virgin, okay? So if Isaiah had used the word Bethulah instead of Alma, the translation would be more clear, since Bethulah is a virgin. So Alma is the broad term, whereas Bethulah is the specific term. It's kind of like if I said, hey, in my backyard I've got a tree back there. That tree, it could be an apple tree, but you don't know if I just use the broad term tree. And so this is kind of where things start to get thorny. So the versions of the Septuagint that we have, so we've talked about the three, so Theodoton, Aquila, Symmachus, these are the three that came after the New Testament period. They all translate the word as neones in Greek, which is also young woman. So this is the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. However, when Matthew quotes Isaiah from the Old Greek of his day, the word he uses is parthenos, that is virgin. So parthenos is also the rendering that an early Christian apologist, Justin Martyr, used against his Jewish opponents like Trypho, where Justin points out that it was the translation of Trypho's own 70 elders from Alexandria, Egypt. So Justin Martyr, he's an early Christian apologist to the early 2nd century, and when he's debating his Jewish opponents, so it's not just in Matthew, Justin Martyr is pointing out to Trypho, he says, hey, your own 70, that's what Septuagint means is 70. He says, your own 70 elders translated it this way. We're going based off of what your guys did. And so he's saying, it does say virgin here, which is part of why there ended up being Aramaic Targums. After some of these debates and stuff like that, the Jews wanted to basically make their text into how they wanted it. And so that's where you get these Jewish Targums from, coming up after that time. And so one of the next textual issues, I kind of was thinking I was still talking about the virgin thing, sorry. So one of the next major issues in translation is the inclusive language stuff. So even though the American Standard Version of 1971 and its revision in 1995 preserved the word virgin in the text of Isaiah 7:14 and made us use of capitalizing the pronouns for God like he, the 2020 edition of the NASB would no longer use words such as he, sons, man, brothers generically when they were intended to include women. So we were just talking about the 2020 NASB, and this is some of the differences with it.
So, okay.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So what would they, I'm not sure I understand that.
Okay. So you don't understand what's the difference, or?
Would no longer use words.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of try to demonstrate that.
Example, you're gonna give
So
us-
yeah, I'm going to give
okay.
some, especially in the NIV here in a second. So you'll kind of see where this kind of works out. So yeah, words that are supposed to, like if they say brothers and they mean brothers and sisters in Christ, right? They were just going to, instead of saying brothers, they're going to say like people or whatever. Yeah, so that's one of the big differences to the 2020, which is why a lot of people still use the 1995 NASB. So here's an example. An example would be seen at Micah 6:8, where the NASB 1995 reads, "He has told you, O man, what is good," where the 2020 revision reads, "He has told you, mortal one, what is good." And that kind of sounds, I think it sounds kind of dumb. But the Lockman Foundation, who produced the NASB, is also the publisher of the Legacy Standard Bible, which does not use the inclusive language. So the Revised Standard Version was revised again in 1990 to the New Revised Standard Version, and in 2001, basically the 2001 it was bought out by Crossway, and evangelicals would produce the ESV, the English Standard Version. So the NRSV has inclusive language where the ESV does not. So I'm going to try to lay this out. So you have again we had the Revised Version right in the States, and we had the Revised Version in England, and the American Standard Version in the States. And so the American Standard Version becomes the New American Standard Version, right? And so you have the Revised Version becoming the Revised Standard Version, then the New Revised Standard Version. And so there's two different lines. But within the New Revised Standard Version line, eventually it's bought out by Crossway, and they produce the ESV. And so within both lines here, the NASB they basically have a Bible that has inclusive language and one that doesn't. So the Legacy Standard Bible is basically like the NASB, except that's the difference. And then the NRSV, it has inclusive language, and the ESV does not, if that's as clear as mud. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Explain that to me later.
Yeah, so yeah, it does get confusing. So here in Hebrews 2, you'll look at the difference between the NIV 1984 and the NIV 2011. So I've highlighted some of the words that you're going to see the differences here. It says, "What is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him? You made him a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor and put everything under his feet. And putting everything under him, God left nothing that is not subject to him. Yet at present we do not see everything subject to him, but we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, not crowned with the glory and honor, now crowned with the glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone." So I'm going to go to the next one, and you'll see immediately it says, "What is mankind that you are mindful of them? A son of man that you care for him? You made them a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and honor and put everything under their feet. In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them. Yet at present we do not see everything subject to them, but we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that the grace of God he might taste death for everyone." So it's ironic that the inclusive language actually makes it more confusing. If you actually take a passage like that and you're reading it, it doesn't really make the connections that it's supposed to. So realizing that the word man can be both collective and individualistic demonstrates the richness of the word man that no other word has. So person can't be collective, and humanity can't be individualistic. So the word man there for the English fits so well because, especially if you just understand, it can mean a broader term. So the generic use of man has become less unacceptable in recent years due to the versatility of the word and the problems that seem to come up in an unnecessary attempt to avoid it. So I guess we'll let the train go by here for a second. So I guess the purpose of this is saying, okay, there was kind of a wave of translations that were like, oh, we got to have inclusive language, and they started to be like kind of do this on the hyper end of things. They started kind of getting too far on the end, and people started realizing, wait a minute, a lot of this is actually harder to understand that we're doing this, and so now they're kind of reeling it in, and a lot of translations are trying to balance that better and not trying to be completely one side or the other, but really make better decisions based on the way people talk and what really would communicate best what's being described in the text.
For example,
So what?
for example,
What like?
not, I'm talking about translations, which translations are going,
Oh, so like, well, I was just so for instance the the NAS, so the new international version we just looked at in 2011, like that was a great example. That was back in 2011 where like it was kind of overboard, and so you're
Right.
seeing where from 1984 where it was like they were kind of going too far with it, and so now like versions that are coming out, even though they might have some inclusive language, they're not using quite as much. And I wouldn't know off the top of my head which translations are, you know what I mean? So, but I know, I mean, just from what I've read, people are starting to realize, wait, we got to reel this in a little bit further because it's kind of getting out of hand.
getting
People are,
politically correct.
yeah, it's somewhat trying to be politically correct, and to some degree, people, I mean, some committees really are trying to communicate better because even some of the guys that I was looking at, Mark Ward, for example, he was talking about how his daughter was reading the Bible and she's like, "Daddy, why is Christianity only for boys?" And it's like, so you have people like that, and so there are a lot of committees. They really are trying to just give the best balance of what words make sense within the text, what's being communicated, and that kind of stuff. So new discoveries such as the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in the 20th century invite updates and revisions as well, where the King James utilizes the Masoretic text, which is a Hebrew text that dates around the 9th century AD until the end of the Middle Ages. This is our latest source for the Hebrew Old Testament. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're our earliest source that date to around 250 BC to about 130 AD. And of course, we don't want to forget the Septuagint that is still utilized in the readings of the Old Testament. So the Masoretic text, it consists of a massive 35,000 manuscripts, many of which are fragmentary, but numerous nonetheless. They originate from Tiberias, a city on the Sea of Galilee, and are shared between Cambridge University Library, Cairo, Geniza, and the National Library of Israel. The name Masoretic text comes from the Masoretes, which means transmitter of traditions, a group of Jewish scribes. They were the first to add vowels into Hebrew, and they were known for their meticulous techniques they used to preserve the scriptures. And so the Masoretes are the ones that you'll always hear about. I think John actually asked about it the first week, about, so the Masoretes were the ones that would, which Hebrew, it reads from right to left instead of left to right. But what they would do is, just like in Greek and Hebrew, how they have letters also have a numerical value. At the end of each line, they would count up what the numerical value of those would be. And so if what they copied from, if it didn't match up, they would destroy it. And so they came up with these really, really accurate, meticulous techniques for translating and for transmitting the text. And they even had things like knowing what the letter of the very center of their scriptures was, what the very middle word was, and all this stuff. They had all these things they counted up. I couldn't rattle them off the top of my head, but that's usually when you talk about someone that's being really meticulous, they're talking about the Masoretes. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're the most famous Old Testament texts, and as their name suggests, they were unearthed around the region of the Dead Sea. So the caves at Qumran, they brought us a total of about 900 manuscripts, and about 210 represent about every book of the Old Testament other than Esther. And so you can see on this diagram here, or this picture, where Qumran is in relation to the Dead Sea. And so in Qumran they found 900, and these other sites they've accumulated about 40 other manuscripts. And I won't pronounce this for you. You can look at them on your own. But just kind of give you an idea that there's these various locations around the Dead Sea that they've begin to find manuscripts at, and that's they are our oldest.
You say they were older?
They are our oldest. The Dead Sea.
All of them.
Yeah. As a whole. So in 1947, we found the first fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which include the Great Isaiah Scroll. That is an entire copy of the book of Isaiah dated to around 150 to 100 BC. This Isaiah scroll is one of the greatest testimonies to how consistent the transmission process for the Jewish text could be. So, sometimes you'll hear this, that the Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Isaiah scroll from the Masoretic text, in fact, there was a guy, the Wes Huff that we were just talking about not long ago. Wes Huff was on the Joe Rogan Experience, and Wes Huff, he's a scholar in this field, and he made a little bit of a sloppy error. He goes, yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text, they're word for word. They're word for word. And I kind of cringed a little bit, and I knew that all these guys would come after him, and they did. So it is incredibly close. It's like 92.5% accurate, but them being 1,000 years apart, it's amazing how close they are. And you got to remember that some of the differences had to do with the fact that the Masoretes they implemented a vowel system, and there's just spelling differences. And so all things considered, they're extremely close. It is impressive that a text 1,000 years apart from each other would be so close as they are. So it's always good to be careful in how you present things to people. So a lot of people, they'll always bring up the Isaiah text because they are the closest, and there is an incredible transmission between the two. But we should be fair in our analysis. Isaiah may be extremely close, but the Jeremiah scroll that the Dead Sea Scrolls is about 15% shorter. Some people say about a third shorter. And so, this could easily be accounted for by Jeremiah's own words that during his time, opposition to God's people involved destroying their manuscripts. So there would be a reason for it, but it's like, oh, well, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're identical to, and they're getting that from the Isaiah scrolls. But you can go to something like Jeremiah, and there's a pretty big difference since there's a good section of it not there. So just to tell you that there is some incredible accuracy between the two. We don't want to be foolish in how we present that to people either if we're talking about
Have
it.
the scholars figured out what part of Jeremiah was missing?
I'm sure they do. I wouldn't know off the top of my head, but yeah, they would be able to. I mean, I probably wouldn't even take that good of a scholar to be able to tell you what the difference is. But here's just kind of a chart of some of the different, so you have the Masoretic text, Dead Sea Scrolls, Samaritan Pentateuch, Septuagint, Theodotin, Aquila, Symmachus, and there's the dates next to them there, just to kind of give you, I just thought this chart might be helpful just to kind of glance at. But you can kind of see where they date to, the Masoretic text, 9th century, Dead Sea Scrolls, and so on and so forth. And so these are all sources we would use to look at the Old Testament, some of the transmission of the Old Testament. And so we really have those three main groups, though. So you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, the versions of the Septuagint, and the Masoretic text, and that kind of constitutes the main sources for the transmission of the Old Testament. So when we talk about translation theory, and we kind of had a chart like this, I think last time it was of medieval, either medieval or no, it was ancient translations, and so you kind of have the end of paraphrase, and you have word for word, and you have everything in between, and so we're gonna talk about some of these. So every translation is trying to wrestle with the same problem. In the words of the authors of Scribes in Scripture, do I want to draw the reader into the world of the Bible, or do I want to draw the Bible into the world of the reader? And all translations face this tension. So, if you're trying to be word for word, you're trying to draw them into what is actually being said. Whereas, translations that are more dynamic equivalents, which we talked a little bit about last time, that's where you're trying to really, do the opposite, right? So the Italians have a phrase for this, tradutori. It means translators are traitors. So without fail, translators will always at one point or another betray their own principles in order to serve the reader. So even a translation that's trying to be very formal, very word for word, at some point they're going to have to realize, wait a minute, this isn't going to work here. And just the opposite, whenever you have translations that are a little more trying to be meaningful and more idea, there's times they're going to say, well, we're really going to have to do more literal here. It just makes more sense. So Martin Luther, he once exclaimed that he made Moses sound so German that no one would ever think he was a Jew. It sounds awful now. However, he was referring to idioms, not ethnicity. So wordplay, alliteration, and meanings of names, they all quickly vanish when translated to another language. So it's for these reasons that we have such a glut of Bible translations on our hands. And so do we have too many? Well, certainly. Though there are loads of translations due to differences in translation theory, there's a more practical reason for why there's so many. Does anyone want to take a wild guess? Oh, yeah, money.
Money.
Is that what you were going to say?
All the money.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. So, yes, money. The market has a place for new translations, and if people buy them, companies will make them. So according to the Evangelical Christian Publishers Association in 2021, the best-selling Bibles in order were as follows. You have the NIV, the KJV, the New Living Translation, English Standard Version, and New King James Version. So copyrights play a huge role in the production of translations as well. So translation copyrights limit someone to cite only a few hundred verses before written permission is required. And after that, royalties may even be demanded in compensation. So it is about money in one sense. That's one of the big reasons. And there are a lot of people, that, not to say that they're not making money from actually producing a translation and people buying it, but it's the fact that whenever they start coming out with things, just as they'll have resource guides, Sunday school materials, commentaries, whatever they have, if they're producing that, if you have your own translation, you don't have to pay royalties to somebody else. And so it becomes economic for a publisher to provide their own translation to avoid paying royalties to another publisher. And so Tyndale House has the New Living Translation, Crossway has ESV, Zondervan has the NIV, B&H Publishing has the CSB, and the Lockman Foundation has the NASB and Legacy Standard Bible. So it just becomes efficient if you're going to have all these other things you're producing, especially commentaries are huge, and so you might as well have your own translation so that you don't have to keep paying out royalties to somebody else and citing them and all this stuff. So I'm going to end with some translations to avoid, and we're going to talk about some good ones also. I'll try to be brief about this. So the first one I would mention is the New World Translation done by Jehovah's Witnesses. It's the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. So we actually brought up one of the issues I think it was last time we met, where we were talking about the Granville Sharp construction, how they deliberately, and this is true for really through the whole translation, is that they are trying to fit the Bible to their theology. And so Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't believe in the deity of Christ in the way that we would. They would say Jesus is a God. He's not the God. He's the first and greatest creation of Jehovah. And so at John 1:1 in the New World Translation, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God." And the Greek below it, so this does get a little complicated because there is no, so the word "a," it's an indefinite article, and in Greek you don't have an indefinite article. So you would translate that based on the syntax of a sentence, and this goes beyond stuff that I'm familiar with. So the definite article, the word "the," which is like "ha" in Greek or "tain" or "tais," you do translate that. But the Jehovah's Witnesses, they will give you a whole 4 or 5 minute spill on why you should translate the indefinite article here and stuff. So just to cut through the nonsense and just kind of explain this as well as I can, if you were to take the concept that they use, which I can't remember the whole argument, but if you used the same principles they used to say it was the word was a God here, if you were to apply that same standard and those same rules to just 5 verses later in John 1:6, so John 1:6 says there was a man sent from God whose name was John. If you were to apply the same grammatical rules that they used to do it here, that verse would read, there was a man sent from a God whose name was a John. And it would just, because it has to do with, I think, the aorist and arthrist form of the word and stuff like that. But it just doesn't, it's not consistent. You can't do it that way. Another great example is Colossians 1:15 and 16. You'll notice they add this word. It says, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, because by means of Him all other things were created in the heavens and on the earth, the things visible and the things invisible, whether they are thrones, lordships, or governments, or authorities, all other things have been created through Him and for Him. And without reading it, you can tell there's the word "other." It's not there. It's not in the Greek. They add a word. There is a Greek word for "other," and it's not there. So modern translations other than that will not have that in the text, and they deliberately do that. So avoid translations with a theological agenda. So something like the New World Translation is probably the one I would say is the number one just cultic Bible that you want to avoid for that reason. Number 2, I would say the Message. So it's a strong paraphrase. So it's produced by Eugene Peterson, published by NAF Press. The Message is not really meant to be a Bible, or at least intended to replace your normal reading Bible, but meant to give you a fresh look at the Bible in a way that will jar you out of the rut of glossing over verses and chapters you've been reading your whole life. And so the good thing I would say about Eugene Peterson, he knows what he's doing. He's not trying to he would tell you, which I think he's passed away now, but Eugene Peterson, he wasn't trying to make a Bible to lull people or to deceive them or anything like that. He made it for the purpose of taking people that were familiar with the Bible already and trying to break them of the stuff that you just get so used to you're not even seeing it anymore. And so the Message, where it's a strong paraphrase, a lot of people, you might think, okay, well, it would be a good Bible for my kid or for a nephew or so there are Bibles that are good at that. So like the New Living Translation or the NIV, something like that. You even have readers editions for like younger people. There are good translations out there that do that. A paraphrase is not a translation. It's not a translation. So again, the Message, it can be helpful. There's people that have found it to be helpful, but its target audience is not people that are new to the Bible. Its target audience is the people that have been reading it for a long time, and so there's a whole different spectrum of what it's trying to get at. But I would say avoid strong paraphrases altogether. So this is just an example of the Message, and I'm just going to take John 1:1 and Colossians 1:15 and 16 again, just to show you kind of where it's sounds a little different. So it says the Word was first. The Word present to God, God present to the Word was God. Nothing heretical about it, but it's not a translation. And just to show you that they're trying to get you to see it differently and hear it differently than you may have heard it every other time you've heard it. And so Colossians 1:15 and 16, it says, we look at the Son and see the God who cannot be seen. We look at His Son and see God's original purpose in everything created. For everything, absolutely everything, above and below, visible and invisible, rank after rank after rank of angels, everything got started in Him and finds its purpose in Him. Again, there's nothing like heretical about that, but it's not a translation. And, again, it's okay as long as you know, hey, this is what this is for. I don't want to look at it as it's being actually translating the words, and it can be helpful in the right place. So avoid Bibles that aren't translations. So here's one that I came across, and I wish I had a whole session to really go into this. So the Passion Translation. Who's ever read the Passion Translation or anything from it?
Never heard of it.
Never heard. I really didn't know much about it. I'd heard of it before. So while claiming to be a dynamic translation, this Bible has taken many liberties that are not warranted by sound translation methodologies and is more of a paraphrase. And so I'm going to explain why this isn't in the same category as the Message. So one of the claims is that Brian Simmons, by the way, it's an individual that did this. He says that the Holy Spirit downloaded a bunch of knowledge into my brain. And so he comes from a Pentecostal charismatic background that colors his theology and throughout the Passion Translation. And so I don't have anything against Pentecostals or charismatics or whatever. That's not the point. The point is, he has a very particular place that he's coming from, and it colors his theology. He doesn't use sound methods of translation, and this translation is just all over the place. But there's a lot of stuff that he does that is just, so for instance, Pentecostals, they like to use the word anointed a lot. So I forgot how much it is in most, on average that you'd find in your other English translations, but you might find the word anointed a couple dozen times in your normal Bible. He has it in there like 200 times because he's trying to get, again, it's his particular theological position and what he's trying to color stuff to be. So he also claims to be using Aramaic originals as the source of his translation. So Aramaic originals may sound really sophisticated, it may sound really cool, but other scholars, they kind of don't really know what he's talking about to some sense and think that he might be referring to Syriac manuscripts that are otherwise known as the Peshitta. So again, this sounds really sophisticated and stuff, but here's why he's doing that, at least best that I can tell because I was kind of looking into some of this stuff. Which, by the way, if you're familiar with Mike Winger has a whole video on the Passion Translation that he really goes into detail because he did do a ton of research just on this, and it's just phenomenal. But so when Brian Simmons, who translated this, talks about Aramaic originals, and he says that he's using, best they can tell, the Peshitta, which I think that he has confirmed that that's what he's talking about. So those are manuscripts that come a few hundred years after Christ. So for the most part, the Old Testament and New Testament, he's using sort of the same sources for the most part that most other committees would use. So the New Testament uses the so the Nession 28 is what most committees would be using. And then the Old Testament, they would use what's called the Biblica Hebraica Studegartensia, which is basically the Old Testament version, like the Hebrew version of the Nession 28. So the Biblica Hebraica Studegartensia is essentially taking the Dead Sea Scrolls, taking the Masoretic text, taking whatever sources they have, and trying to figure out what's the original text of the Hebrew. And so he does use both of those. However, he's using the Aramaic originals, and from what I can tell, to try to validate some of the weird translations that he has in his work. And so he's just all over the place. But he incorporates an idea from Hebrew words that basically, when a Hebrew word has more than one sense to it, whenever it can be translated, which a lot of words obviously can be translated a lot of different ways, he has this way of translating it where this one Hebrew word means like three different things simultaneously. And it really just has some weird translating methods. So Brian Simmons has also blatantly lied about his translation background. So whenever he's been asked and interviewed about, that's some of the stuff that Mike Winger got into. Whenever he started looking into, what parts of these groups and stuff that he's been a part of, and he actually found out that what he said was just blatantly untrue. Really, his translation is this: he has special revelation from God that he's using to translate his Bible. That's dangerous, okay? So when comparing the Passion Translation with virtually all other translations, you'll find about 50% more material. Now, it's one thing to kind of have words and you expound upon a little bit to try to get the meaning across. 50% more material is a lot. That's a lot to be, and again, Mike Winger had some excellent examples of a verse that's just a couple lines, and it's here it's a paragraph where he's inserting all his own theology and stuff that he wants to be there. And so, if anything, I would use this as an example of avoiding translations done by an individual. N.T. Wright is a great scholar. He has a Bible, a New Testament, that he basically translated the whole thing. N.T. Wright is an awesome historian. I would not lean into using a Bible or a translation done by an individual. So, the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. Let me see how much time we got here. We're running close. So, I don't know about the translation as a whole, but sometimes there are places that such a large wart exists that you can't help but think that it's coming from a particular place. And so the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, it's a very liberal Bible. And here's one of the places where you can kind of see what they're doing. So 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9, it says, "Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. The sexually immoral, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, and men who engage in illicit sex." So I'm going to we're going to go through and show you these words. So there's a problem here. The first word that they translate as male prostitutes, it's so specific, it kind of doesn't, think about male prostitutes, how big of a range of people does that hit? And then you have men who engage in illicit sex. Well, it almost sounds like the sexually immoral, the very first one, and it's so broad that it's like, well, who's what's this talking about? So if you went to the ESV, you'd see that last line there says, "Nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality." So if I bring up the Greek there, the words being translated, and this does get kind of messy because it does get complicated, but I'm doing my best to explain it. So you have malakoi, which is what's translated to adulterers, and you have the word arsenokoitai, which is translated as men who practice homosexuality. So if I go to the glossary so the Nession text, the Greek text, so within that text, that whenever they're defining what these words mean, malakoi means fine, soft, male prostitute, a male homosexual who is the passive sex partner. Okay? The word arsenokoitai, the glossary says one engaging in homosexual acts, like referring to the active male partner, a sexual deviant. So where this gets kind of complicated is arsenokoitai. It's a word that Paul makes up. Now, he doesn't come up with it out of nowhere. What he does is he's using words from the Old Testament, from the Greek Septuagint. So if I went to Proverbs 25:15, here's a word that is the word malakoi is used in the Septuagint. With patience, the ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue will break a bone. And there it's the word malakoi, and it's also in Proverbs 26. So malakoi is actually the harder of the two. So it's soft, but it's in the context of talking about sexual immorality. So if I went to arsenokoitai, here's the main one that gets argued about and stuff, arsenokoitai. So this is where Paul is drawing this from Leviticus 18:22. So it says, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It's an abomination." So the Septuagint, here's where Paul gets the words. It says, so you have arsenos, the first word, and you have koitain, which is the second word. Now this is the place where Paul is drawing this from. So if he's going to Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, where you shall not lie with a male as with a woman, and the words are arsenos, which means male, and then koitain is really means like beds, or bed in the sense of like a marriage bed. So what is that saying? And so there are, this is the NRSVUE is an example of a liberal Bible that is trying to make things as friendly as possible to people that are part of the LGBTQ community and all that stuff. But it's really just blatantly not what Paul is saying. Paul is saying that it's homosexuals. The last one I'm going to touch on, and I know we're running out of time here. So the Tree of Life version. So one glaring oddity about this translation is the fixation on proper names of God and hew to Jewish tradition. And so the other issue is notable is that the habitual tossing in of Hebrew words, the transliterations like Shabbat for Sabbath. And so here at Psalm 110, they put, "Adonai declares to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." And really, there's a play on words going on in here where it's the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. I think this one's a better example, though, in 2 Peter. It almost just gets ridiculous. "Simon Peter, a slave and an emissary of Messiah Yeshua, to those who have received faith equal to ours, through the righteousness of our God and Savior, Messiah Yeshua. May grace and shalom be multiplied to you in knowledge of God and to Yeshua our Lord." And then you go a few verses down, "For no prophecy was ever brought forth by human will. Rather, people spoke from God as they were moved by the Ruach HaKodesh." It's the Holy Spirit. And so, the thing you start to ask is, okay, what are Hebrew words, Hebrew transliterations, doing in my English text of a Greek translation? It just becomes too convoluted, and it's really, I guess their goal of the Tree of Life version was to appeal to Masoretic Jews, Jews that are trying to be converted. But what they've actually, studies have found out is that most people that are using this were never Jewish. That the people just like it because it sounds cool. It sounds really, and really it's just not necessary. You're better off just with a translation that's giving you what's being said. So how many people know what Ruach Kadesh is, or whatever it is? So I think that's going to end us today. So I'll pick up next time, I'll do what versions should I use and stuff, and we'll pick up with that and get into issues of canon. So I know I blew through a lot there. There's a lot of material. Any questions? I may not be able to answer them, but any questions or anything?
Can you summarize that in about 3 sentences?
No, I can't. Sorry. All right. Yes, sir.
In my church, I've heard a preacher say, several people say, you don't add anything to or take anything away from the Bible.
Yeah.
What blows that out of the water?
Oh yeah. I mean, even some of the stuff if you can catch the stuff we've been through online already. Yeah, there's and Jesus and his disciples didn't see it in the literal way that a lot of people see that today either. So, yeah, good point. Anything else?
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, sir. Bob, would you close us in prayer, please? Sure. Yeah.
God, we thank you for tonight, for this class, for Brian's studying and presentation, so that we can gain better understanding of how we got the Bibles that we're using today. God, thank you for the work of scholars who spent their lives trying to translate the ancient scriptures so that we would have them in the language we can read. Help us to read them. Help us to study the Bible. apply it to our lives, and be the people you want us to be. Thank you for all that you do for us in Jesus' name. Amen.